This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to talk a little bit more about Bitcoin Core Dev's rewriting history, as well as going through an update for the soft fork we've been talking about. Today's video is a follow-up to yesterday's video, which you should watch before watching this video. That video is called The Secret History of Satoshi Dice, which was a gambling game that was played in the early days using the Bitcoin blockchain. And Peter Todd has singled out Luke Dasher in a recent podcast, portrayed him as a crazy person for filtering out Satoshi Dice spam transactions with his Eligius mining pool in 2012 and 2013, when in fact the actual history is that it turns out that other Bitcoin Core devs like Matt Corallo and Greg Maxwell had similar complaints at the time about Satoshi Dice spam, and most importantly also still knew how to identify spam back then and hadn't yet descended into a Clintonian state of linguistic nihilism where no one knows what spam is and it depends on what the meaning of the word is. I almost feel like we've reached this state. As we saw in yesterday's video, Greg Maxwell even wrote a patch back then in 2013, 2014. He wrote a patch for Satoshi Dice to help node runners filter out the spam. This is Raoul Duke on Bitcoin Talk Forum saying that as per my request, Greg Maxwell wrote a patch to apply to the Bitcoin client that will drop all transactions to Satoshi Dice and simply not relay or verify them. In other words, Greg Maxwell was helping people filter transactions here. Vernon715 writes, and why would we want to do that? Walkboard agrees, indeed, why would we want to do that? And just a reminder from yesterday's video, Raoul Duke's response was legendary. Why would we want to do that? I don't know. Maybe you'd want to save 80% of the bandwidth your Bitcoin client spends and 80% of the CPU cycles used to verify transactions. I know I do. I don't care about gambling and I don't want to carry out their transactions. It's enough being forced to carry them on my hard drive disk when they get included in a block. Free market, baby. Satoshi Dice is free to spam the blockchain. I'm free to block them from my computer and network and not help them in any way I see fit. By the way, this isn't a war against Satoshi Dice. It's only a matter of having the option. And importantly, if you guys don't like me and everyone else having the option to block transactions we consider spam or prejudicial, who's trying to censor who after all? This is Raoul Duke back in March of 2013. And then Chad Pleb sent me the link to Peter Todd's discussion at the same time talking about Satoshi Dice. Peter writing, yes, Erik Voorhees is well aware of that and has been contacted. The fact that Peter Todd was rolling out, I believe it looks like an early version of RBF replaced by Fee, and so anything that was using zero confirmations like Satoshi Dice would be in trouble. Peter goes on to write, they will be introducing off-chain betting in the near future, so it won't be an issue for them soon. I and John are discouraging mainnet miners from making use of this patch immediately. And as Chad Pleb writes here, no, the point here is that his RBF, Peter Todd's RBF, would have put Satoshi Dice at risk, so he contacted them to do it off-chain. And in the interview above, he's clearly lying in that sense. Also, it's interesting to see that Charlie Lee, who is the creator of Litecoin, back in 2013 said that he considered Satoshi Dice transactions to be spam. This is an old video from Bitcoin Motorist that I'll put a link to in the description notes below. But basically Charlie Lee saying, I want to prevent things like Satoshi Dice from bloating the chain because it's spam. So he understood the problems with spam back then as well. And then Melvin Carvalho points out here that Erik Voorhees, after Satoshi Dice, after selling it for over 100,000 Bitcoin, later unfortunately sided with Segwit2x, later led the big block side of the block size wars, and now he's an angel investor in Citrea, which wants to turn Bitcoin into Ethereum. Bitcoin Anon writes here, responds, basically links to my video and asks Matt Corallo to comment on my video saying, why were you fine with filters on Satoshi Dice, but you're not fine with filters today? Matt Corallo responds, bro, stop watching that guy, meaning me. He has no interest in accuracy. He just wants to FUD. Go read Peter's post, which goes into a ton. This is Pieter Wuille's post, not Peter Todd. Go read Peter's post, which goes into a ton of the history of filters if you actually want to learn. And then Satson Silver responds to Matt Corallo saying, most of us filterers have read and reread Peter's post and put in dozens of hours researching and listening to Merch and others on podcasts, yet still come to the conclusion something doesn't square and there was indeed a shift within Core. What do you mean accuracy? All Matt Kratter did was show receipts of Core Dev's own words, which is, I appreciate him defending me there. If you're enjoying this video so far, just pause really briefly here to ask you to help to support the channel. Hit the subscribe button, that does really help. Leave a like, leave a comment, question, suggestion for a future video, and share this video with a friend or family member. So if we go back and look at another thread here, Bitcoin Anon asking Matt Corallo to respond, and then Matt Corallo doesn't respond. Bitcoin Anon writes, "You didn't answer the question." Matt Corallo writes, "I gave you a specific place to go look to read a long-form analysis on the issues. I don't have time to respond in intricate details to every question on here." It would seem that why did you support filters back then but you don't today? That's a personal question, and that could probably be answered in 1 or 2 sentences. Matt Corallo choosing not to answer it. Bitcoin Anon responds to him, "Then you obviously do because you're responding. You choose not to because you're either 1, afraid to answer, number 2, leaving number 2 open for you." Matt Corallo responds, "Just tired of answering the same questions over and over and over again, but since you're too lazy to use Google here," and then he links to Pieter Wuille's discussion of the spam issue, which I'll put a link to in the description notes below. It's quite interesting and does summarize many of the arguments. Unfortunately, this doesn't really answer why Matt Corallo used to believe in spam filters and doesn't anymore. But scrolling down, I did see an interesting passage here. This is a lot of this, or most of this is stuff we've already covered on the channel. For example, Pieter Wuille writing here, "I believe that in the long term, such, in my view, suboptimal use, in other words, using the Bitcoin blockchain as arbitrary storage or cloud storage, such suboptimal use will be driven to alternative solutions anyway as on-chain space grows more valuable." In other words, he believes that spam will be priced out. I certainly disagree with that, and I'll put a link to my video in the description notes below that talks about, will Bitcoin spam get priced out? And I conclude that you just can't assume the conclusion, but you don't have to listen to me. You could also listen to Greg Maxwell back in 2015, I believe. I'll put a link to this where he writes that, this is Greg Maxwell, Bitcoin Core Dev. He writes, "The demand for cheap, highly replicated perpetual storage is unbounded, and Bitcoin cannot and will not satisfy that demand for non-cash, non-ecash, non-Bitcoin usage." In other words, at least Greg Maxwell back then seemed to believe that arbitrary data storage could outbid Bitcoin transactions, and so something needed to be done about that. Now, obviously, the other thing, as I said, we shouldn't expect a long essay by Pieter Wuille. I'm sorry, misspelled Peter there. We shouldn't expect a long essay by Pieter Wuille about spam to contain an explanation about why Matt Corallo used to believe that spam existed back in 2012 and should be filtered, but no longer does in 2025. That's something Matt Corallo could have answered, but I imagine he's embarrassed by the inconsistency. This is the thing, debating with core devs feels increasingly like debating with Fauci and his henchmen. This feels so much like COVID. The debate is fake. It's already been decided. False talking points are pushed as far as they can be, and then they're replaced by equally false talking points. There's endless gaslighting. History's getting constantly rewritten. And of course, the insiders all have each other's backs and will protect each other forever at the expense of truth, even when it contradicts actual posts we can see from Bitcoin Talk back from the early days. So I think this is why it's so important that Bitcoin Core finds a good way to route around all these bad actors at Bitcoin Core. And as we move to Bitcoin Knots and contemplate a soft fork, these are ways that the Bitcoin network is proving itself to be anti-fragile. But controlling 20% of nodes is not enough. This leads us to the latest news on soft forks. Data reporting here in a post from December 3rd, 2025, reporting saying, "I am pleased and relieved to announce that the Reduced Data Temporary Soft Fork," this is RDTS, "has received an official number assignment BIP 1110. You may now refer to the proposal as BIP 1110 instead of the RDTS. That's definitely easier to say. As Starheart writes here, 110 is a great number. The Bitcoin white paper was posted at 1:10 p.m. Eastern Time, 11:10 p.m. Pacific. Wonder if Satoshi was going for 111 or 1111, so numerology involved there. Here's the post from Merch that announces that these two new BIP numbers have been assigned, BIP 89 for something that's unrelated, and then BIP 110 for what used to be called BIP 444. I'm not going to go into the politics of this. I don't completely understand it, and I don't think it's important as a hill to die on, but there was quite a bit of behind-the-scenes stuff, as I understand it, going on in the fight for BIP 444 being changed to BIP 110, or whether the number was actually assigned. So, but I'll put a link to this. You can go read it. It is now officially BIP 110 on the Bitcoin GitHub. I'll put a link to this so you can read about it. Data Gnome writes, for everyone who is calling it BIP 444, you're welcome to continue doing so, but that number was not officially assigned by BIP editor's comment on the BIP pull request on the BIP PR, so I'll be using BIP 110 moving forward. One of my Chinese friends has assured me that this is a much better BIP number, given, and other people point this out, given that 4 in Mandarin sounds like the word for death, and so 444, BIP 444 would be BIP death, death, death. There's still quite a bit of hash rate, large Bitcoin mining pools in China, so maybe this matters. Perhaps it doesn't. I kind of like the idea of 444 as being triple death to spam. Either way, though, 110, 444, whatever it is fine with me. The really important thing here is not the bike shedding. The important thing is to get a soft fork done that helps to fix all these spam problems at the consensus level once and for all, and make it really clear to spammers, as we did with Satoshi Dice, as we did with Vitalik Buterin and Opportun back in 2014. Make it really clear to spammers and scammers that they should move on to other chains. Data Gnome reports here as well that the activation branch of RDTS of BIP 110 is now ready for review, and it has been put as a pull request into knots. So this could end up being incorporated into knots if it's accepted. I'll also let you know when an official UASF user activated soft fork client has been released. And if I'm understanding this correctly, this will take the form of either a standalone client or could be bundled with a new version of Bitcoin knots, as we're seeing here if it's accepted, or probably both. So it should be available to download for your desktop or laptop. It'll probably also be made available on Start9 and Umbrel and similar services. And if you choose to run this UASF software, you will be able to signal your support for the soft fork and eventually help to enforce the new rules as we move forward if the soft fork is activated. We'll also be digging deeper in this channel into the pros and cons of what BIP 110 proposes to do, as many of you have requested. Here's the thing, those soft forks do take time, so it's important to be patient, let things unfold at their own speed. And there's also, I'm hearing rumblings of other soft forks being proposed as we speak, so stay tuned. There's definitely never a dull day in Bitcoin. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video, and let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.